There is no doubt America's election for president was at times racially charged, and at times it was tough to cover for any journalist, but especially if that journalist stood out. NPR political reporter Asma Khalid joined me in the newsroom many times. She provided amazing analysis of what voters were thinking across the country. But I never thought how difficult that was for her until I read her reporter's notebook on NPR's website. She wrote in part, quote, "Sometime in early 2016, between a Trump rally in New Hampshire, where a burly man shouted something at me about being Muslim, and a series of particularly vitriolic tweets that included some combination of raghead, terrorist, bitch, and jihadi, I went into my editor's office and wept. I cried for the first, but not the last time this campaign season. Through tears, I told her that if I had known my sheer existence, just the idea of being Muslim, would be a debatable issue in the 2016 election, I would have never signed up to do this job." Asma joins me live now. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what did your editor tell you that day in her office?
I wish that I could remember, Carol. You know, I just remember crying, and she said to me that, you know, this was sort of early on during the primary season, and she said, we'll sort of see how it goes. And I go on in that essay that you mentioned to say that I think regardless of how I felt in the heat of that particular moment, I realized that I was too invested. You know, I had been covering the campaign for months at that point, and that this was, you know, the story of a lifetime, as it is for many journalists, and that I sort of felt conflicted because while at times there were these really visceral reactions that people had towards me, towards my appearance, I also really wanted to continue covering this story. It was a story like none other that I'd ever covered before.
The ironic thing is you grew up in Indiana. You played tennis, and you sold Girl Scout cookies. So did it ever enter your mind that as you went, you know, as you went forward doing your job across the country, that people would question your Americanness?
I don't think that I had ever anticipated the degree to which that would be the case. You know, I think that I saw things in this election cycle about who we are as Americans that really saddened me. Things that were said to me that I had never heard before. You know, you mentioned I'm from Indiana. You know, I grew up in the Midwest, went to college in the Midwest, and you know, my town was a fairly small, predominantly white, fairly conservative town, and you know, I never felt out of place at all. And I think part of it is that, you know, people knew me, people knew our family, and I think when you're out on the campaign trail, a lot of times what people see maybe on first impressions is the scarf. That's the most visible impression that they have of you. I think the other side that people don't see is that I'm a Hoosier. And I talk about, you know, once I got to the point where I could sort of engage with voters, I think that they really did often open up because I had this tool set that I had grown up in Indiana and that I understood and knew where a lot of these voters were coming from.
Can you explain what one of the worst incidents were and how you handled it?
I think that one of the worst incidents, I should say one of the incidents that stuck with me because I had never had such a visceral reaction was about a month before the election. I was in Ohio. I went to tag along with some canvassers. This is something I often did. I was covering voters, so different groups would go door to door, and I would sometimes tag along to get a sense of what they were hearing. And in these interactions, you know, I'm kind of the silent fly on the wall. I have a microphone and a badge, and I ask them if I can record, but other than that, I don't say anything. And I was in South Columbus, predominantly white working class neighborhood, and a woman opened the door. She was engaging with a canvasser, answering her questions, but at some point her mother saw me. She opened the front door, came out onto the porch, and started yelling and said, "You need to get off my property." And she looked squarely at me and she said, "She needs to get off my property." And you know, in that moment, if I had been alone, truthfully, I think I would have said thank you and walked away, but I was tagging along with this canvasser who needed to do her job. And so the woman who was actually engaging with the canvasser apologized. She quieted her mother and sent her inside. But throughout the remainder of the canvassing interview, I could hear her mother in the background. She was still so upset that I was on her front porch. And you know, I have tape of it in the background. She's saying, "There's a Muslim on my front porch." And she was so upset viscerally. And I had never experienced something like that, where, you know, usually I say that once you sort of get to talking to people fundamentally, people start sort of seeing that, you know, you're human, I'm human, and they trust you, and they sort of see where you're coming from. And I think a lot of that trust was fundamentally that I grew up in the Midwest. I shared a lot of experiences. You know, I could talk about basketball and steel mills and understood where a lot of these voters were coming from. But in that moment, you know, first impressions, I had never had somebody sort of viscerally hate the idea of me. And
so my last question to you is, where do you think that hate came from, and how do you reconcile it within yourself?
I don't know where it came from exactly. I mean, I can sort of surmise that some of it, I think, is because people have impressions of a group, right? Be they Muslim or whatever a group, and that in a lot of places people haven't had one-on-one contact with someone. Because I would say that I grew up in a place where a lot of folks may not have necessarily always cared for, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but some folks might not have cared for Muslims in the abstract, but they got to know me, they got to know my family. In some places where I was going, I don't think folks had ever met a Muslim. You know, I really got that hunch because it wasn't always negative. In some instances, voters invited me into their homes. They wanted to invite me for the weekend, to spend time with them, to have tea and cookies, because they had never had these one-on-one human interactions. And, you know, Carol, I mentioned that one of the saddest things for me, though, was that my job covering voters was to understand where folks were coming from, you know, to empathize with them. And in some cases, people did return that empathy, but at times, you know, like when I was on that Ohio porch, I don't think that voters reciprocated that empathy.
Well, I must say, Asma, it never came out in your reporting. You're a wonderful journalist, and I'm glad that you joined me so many times during the election. And thanks so much for sharing your story. Asma Khalid, thanks so much.